Hello, I'm Kevin, and as always, welcome to Can't Make This Up, a history podcast where I sit down with authors and historians and just chat a little bit about history. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I want to say thank you to everyone who's been listening throughout the year. This is the last episode of 2022, taking a little break for Christmas and New Year's. But like a lot of people, I got my Spotify Wrapped, an email about that. And as a podcaster, it tells me some really interesting insights. This year, I put out over 800 minutes worth of podcast content, which comes out to be like 13 plus hours. And you guys listen to it. Over 500 of you who listen. This show is in your top 10, which just blows my mind. And there's 28 of you who Can't Make This Up is your number one podcast. Crazy bastards. But thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's really good to know. I mean, I see download numbers, but it's kind of hard to tell if it's just people dipping in and out because they're interested in the subject, or they were looking up the author and they found me, or if it's people that are fans of the show and they keep coming back. So it's really helpful to see that so many people are engaged and are liking the things that I'm putting out. So I just want to say thank you so much. I'm very, very appreciative. That's kind of my wrap for the year. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. My guest is Alexander Rose. Alexander has kind of made a bit of a niche for himself in writing, as he calls, yield espionage. He writes about espionage, much older history of espionage, pre-20th century. He wrote a book, very popular a number of years ago, called Washington Spies, and that became the AMC series Turn. And he's come out with a new book called The Lion and the Fox. This book, which we're going to talk about today, and I think it's the first time we've ever dealt with a book on the American Civil War before. But in this book, he profiles two characters, Thomas Dudley and James Bulloch. These are two rivals representing the North and the South, and they engage in this spy game that plays out on the streets of Liverpool, under the noses of the authorities. So it's a really interesting story, very captivating story. And so I'm really grateful to Alex that he took the time to talk to me about it. We had a lot of technical difficulties trying to make this happen, and he was a great sport. So thank you to him for that. But without any more ado, here is my conversation with Alex Rose.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Welcome to Can't Make This Up. My name's Kevin, your host, and my guest today is Alex Rose. Alex, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you on. If you would, tell us, listeners, a little bit about your background and your previous work.
Well, you may have noticed that I speak with a slightly strange accent, and the reason for that is that I was born in New York many moons ago, and but I went to school in Australia and then in England, and I worked there for a long time until I finally got back to, or sort of circumnavigated the Anglo-spheric world, and got back to the US about, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. So I've been in New York ever since. As for my previous work, I think this is the book, the Lion and the Fox, I think is my sixth book. It's my sort of second book, I think, on actual, sort of intelligence history, serious intelligence history. I sort of jump around subjects quite a lot. So I've written about, I think the last book was about zeppelins and airplanes and that struggle for mastery in the air. And I've written about technological history and military history and all that kind of stuff. But intelligence history is actually my I guess my first love, I guess you could call it. So this is I like to think of this as the kind of sequel to Washington Spies, which took place during the War of Independence, and this one's more of a Civil War story.
Okay, and if listeners haven't read Washington Spies, they definitely should. But they will probably recognize that as being the inspiration for the AMC series Turn.
Yeah, I kind of fell into it. I was a writer and a producer on Turn, Washington Spies for several, I think, for the 4 seasons it was on, which is a lot of fun. This book is, I think this book is a little bit different from Washington Spies. Washington Spies, though I like it, it's a bit more of a, it's a little bit more of a heavier read, I think. Whereas with The Lion and the Fox, I said, I'm going to just tell a kind of an adventure story, and I'm going to tell it fast, and I'm going to, make it dramatic and all this kind of stuff. So it's a slightly different feel to this book. So, maybe your readers will agree. I hope they do.
Yeah, I found it to be a very accessible read, and it's very fast paced, and it has a novelization quality. It feels very much like a Jason Bourne or George Smiley book.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I think I took some. Well, to tell you the truth, I kind of learned quite a lot from working in TV on Turn for those years. I mean, I think the style of the books has changed since learning a little bit more about drama and how to kick off with an exciting cold open and setting the scene and switching scenes and perspectives and all that kind of stuff, while of course keeping to the the historical documentation and the archives and all that kind of stuff. So it is I guess it's not really novelistic. I think it's more, it has some of a novel's sort of a novel's perspectives, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's set the stage for this story. So for starters, much of the book takes place in the UK. So what was Great Britain's take on watching its former colony descend in the Civil War? Because I think for a lot of listeners, learning about the Civil War is very American centric. So what was that? So what was their take from abroad?
It's actually very interesting because like I think most people, I'd always sort of seen the Civil War in terms of the blue and the gray and Gettysburg and Lee and Grant and all this kind of stuff. So switching locations to England, or in particular the city of Liverpool, the mightiest port on earth, and as well as a bit of London. It really you sort of realize that there's all these sort of rather hidden dimensions to the war. But to get back to the question, the British, just generally speaking, the British reaction to the outbreak of the Civil War was one of complete bemusement and befuddlement. Nobody could really understand what they were fighting about. There was one quite large group of Britons, including many of the major newspapers, who were very quite pro-Southern, mostly for economic reasons, but and also because they thought that, well, there was also a romantic attachment to the idea of rebels against the central authority kind of thing. They weren't big fans of Lincoln or the Union. One reason being is that Lincoln was a tariff man, and that was getting in the way of their profits, and they were kind of annoyed about it. And and so there was that sort of group. And I should say that I don't think there's really anyone who publicly said, well, or was in favor of slavery. I mean, I never really read anything about that. I think it was mostly to do with they just kind of assumed that, if they didn't fight, the whole issue would kind of go away after a while. That was basically it. Give it a generation or so, and then the whole slavery would wither on the vine, and then we could get back to business as usual. There was a smaller faction who really did think that the war was about slavery. This was a very small, kind of radical, religiously dissenting group of mostly ministers and various churchgoers who who were staunchly abolitionist from the very beginning, but they weren't really listened to. Another group, and this just illustrates how confused everything was there. Another group basically thought, well, the Southerners were just a bunch of spoiled little boys who were taking their toys and went home because they didn't get what they wanted. And on the other side, there were a lot of people who were quite pro-Northern in a way, mostly because they just thought, it would make it easier to deal with one government rather than two. But in general, they kind of thought that this was another one of their rancorous colonial cousins, inexplicable wars. And so you have Lord Russell, who was the foreign secretary at the time, advising the prime minister, saying, look, I'm paraphrasing, like, I don't really understand what this is all about, really. But for God's sake, let's just keep out of it. And that was the attitude that informed the Declaration of British Neutrality at basically the outbreak of the war. And that's a key part of the book is the South wanted to bring Britain into the war on its side in a kind of an Anglo-Confederate union, and the Union under Lincoln wanted to keep the British neutral because they knew that put pressure on the Southerners. So Britain was the world's hyperpower at the time, and so it was very important what the Royal Navy did. And so that's one of the cruxes of the book is this struggle to either keep Britain in or keep it out. It's a very important part of the story of the Civil War, which you don't often hear.
So the subtitle of your book, which I don't think we've mentioned yet, Two Rival Spies and the Secret Plot to Build a Confederate Navy, really focuses around two characters here. So tell us about the first, the Unionist. Who is Thomas Dudley, and how did he end up in Liverpool?
Great question. Again, that subtitle is a bit of a mouthful, but we had to fit a lot of information in there. But in short, Thomas Dudley was the son of a modest Quaker farmer from New Jersey, and who died. His father died when he was young, and so he worked on his widowed mother's farm with his siblings. He put himself through school. He joined a local attorney's office to get to be apprenticed there, and so he had a very kind of quiet, kind of respectable job as a lawyer in New Jersey. What was interesting about Dudley, I mean, there were many things that were interesting, but one of the things that was interesting was that as a very strict Quaker, he had, I mean, long before this became more common, he had an extreme aversion to slavery. I mean, he really was a dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore abolitionist, and he brooked no dissent about this. And this wasn't just him, chattering and talking about it. He would actually disguise himself in what he thought was a sort of a Southern slaver's outfit, which basically consisted of a whip, a couple of guns, and a cowboy hat of sorts. And he would go down below the Mason-Dixon line at great danger to his own life, and he would try to rescue blacks who'd been kidnapped from across the state lines and and either buy them or just bring them back to their homes, including some who'd worked on his mother's farm. This was a dangerous line of work he was in. And so he did that, and that was in the 1840s, early 1850s. A little later on, as we get closer to the Civil War, he enters Republican politics. and he attends the Republican convention. And while he's there, he performs a little bit of I think deft wire pulling. The old smoky back rooms, back stairs, that kind of thing. And he persuades the New Jersey delegation, of which he was a member, to back Lincoln over their own man. And this helps Lincoln gain the nomination and, of course, later become president. Now, as a reward for this bit of signal service, Lincoln calls him in and around the beginning of the Civil War and says, "Okay, Mr. Dudley, thanks very much for your help. What would you like? Here's a bauble. Would you like to be the ambassador to Japan, or would you like to be consul to Liverpool?" Now, diplomatically speaking, being an ambassador is, of course, a much higher rank than just being a consul, whose main job is really just to make sure that drunk sailors who run out of money can get home, and to stamp passports, and to escort lost travelers and find their luggage, kind of thing. It's a fairly straightforward rubber stamp kind of job. But Dudley had undergone a kind of a traumatic experience. He'd almost drowned in an icy river, and he'd been, when he was counted as dead, he had this miraculous recovery. So he always believed that he was meant for something special, that there was a great mission that he must accomplish before he died. And so, but a practical nature, his health never really quite recovered. So he needed to be near good doctors. And to his mind, there were good doctors in England. It was closer to home. He would just do his job as consul to Liverpool for a year or so, which was the usual stint that one did over there. And then he'd be back home, and he'd get back to his little legal practice. And what happened was that he just inadvertently and unwittingly inherited the most critical intelligence posting in the entire world, and that's where the story begins. As for his antagonist, a fellow called James Bulloch, he's a very different kind of fish. He was a Southerner. He came from a rather wealthy, affluent, slaveholding background, of merchants and plantation owners and in Georgia. Though he himself lived there for only a few years. I think he went to boarding school in Connecticut or something. He then joins, this is 20 years before the war, 20, 30 years before the war, he joins the US Navy and works his way up the officers' ranks. And he's very, very good at his job. He is an excellent sailor. But promotion is slow. And so about a decade or so before the Civil War, he resigns his commission and goes to, as many did, he goes to work for a private steamship company where you could make a lot of money, you could become a partner, and you could also sail these brand new steamships that were coming in as part of the new technology of as the world moved from sail to steam. In the years before he retires. He during that he gains a lot of experience with shipyards and commissioning ships and learning about the design and engineering of ships, which is really useful, which would become very useful later on. Character-wise, unlike Dudley, who had, as far as I can see, no discernible sense of humor whatsoever, Bulloch was this real charmer. He was a real sort of lounge lizard, kind of designedly aristocratic, stylish, charming, all this kind of very patrician. He could talk to lords and ladies, in equal measure. Whereas
quick on his feet.
He was quick on his feet. He was charming, and he was funny and ironic and detached. That kind of rather witty kind of fellow. And he gets recruited at the very beginning of the war by Mallory, who's the secretary of the Confederate Navy, which consisted of essentially one ocean-going ship at the time. So it really wasn't very impressive. He gets hired by him or recruited by him to go to Liverpool to build and commission and acquire a Confederate Navy consisting of blockade runners and commerce raiders and advanced ironclads that would together sweep the US Navy from the oceans and help win the war for the Confederacy. So it was a very important task. So he gets sent over there, and that's part of the story. And then what you have then is that you have Dudley versus Bulloch in Liverpool, sort of playing. What I like to the way I envisaged it was, you remember that from Mad Magazine, that spy versus spy strip of the black spy and the the white spy, and they would always
Oh yeah,
trail.
absolutely.
It's like Tom and Jerry essentially,
Those
but they
little
basically
cartoons.
chased each other around, over the course of the Civil War, and they, whereas Bulloch kind of treated it as a bit of a game, at least at first. Dudley always took it deadly seriously and sort of vowed to destroy this viper in the in Liverpool, whereas Bulloch just spent most of his time trying to outwit and outfight and outfox Dudley. So that's the basic structure and impetus of the book.
Hey, gang. I wanted to take a little break from our conversation today to tell you about the new partner of the podcast, Libro.fm. If you're like me and you have a long commute, or if you spend a lot of time with your AirPods in and you're listening to something, you might enjoy audiobooks, just like I do. Libro.fm is an audiobook subscription service in which you can get a credit for a new audiobook every month, but also you can purchase additional audiobooks at a pretty decent discount. And the kicker for Libro.fm relative to other audiobook services is that a portion of every sale goes to support an independent bookseller of your choice. So it's a great way that you can listen to audiobooks while also supporting independent bookshops. So if you'd like to check out Libro.fm, there is a link for it down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. And if you want to join up with that link, you can get an additional audiobook credit in your first month. So check out Libro.fm. Now back to our conversation. So I kind of like to imagine Dudley with like a conspiracy board up in his drawing room, with all this, red strings connecting. So like if that existed, without giving away too much of the book, like what would that board look like?
He doesn't exactly have the old conspiracy board. He has something quite close to it. And it's part of the book. It's that when he gets to Liverpool, you have to remember that Liverpool was essentially, for Dudley, for any Union man, essentially enemy territory. Liverpool was Britain was quite, as I mentioned before, very pro-Confederate for the first couple of years of the war. Liverpool was way further than that. I mean, I think it was Bulloch who says that when he arrived in Liverpool, there was more Confederate bunting and flags and so on there than in Richmond. That's how pro Dixie Liverpool was. There are a couple of reasons for this. One of which is that they had very long, in the old days they had slaving ties, and in the 19th century they had cotton ties. Liverpool was the center of the world's sort of cotton empire, and it also built more ships than the rest of the world combined. So it's this kind of real trading power of that put anything else to shame. But this is enemy territory for Dudley, and when he gets in there, when he first walks around Liverpool, he's hated. I mean, he's regarded as people are actively conspiring and plotting against him to make sure he can't do his job. Whereas Bulloch, of course, just swans around, sort of like just owning the place. So what Dudley does, though, is that it takes him quite a long time, but he eventually, just using newspaper articles and using his own spies that he hires, and a lot of visits to the records and customs house and all this kind of thing, he very slowly builds up a picture of a secret Confederate network operating in Liverpool, of front companies, and all of which was centered on Bulloch, by the way. They're centered on companies smuggling guns and cotton and luxuries and and money and so forth back and forth from the Confederacy, and breaking the Lincoln's blockade. it is a major concern. It is a huge cartel thing that's going on there. But he eventually manages to work out who's doing what, and so he compiles. It's extraordinary what he does. He compiles a list of about 240 companies in Liverpool who are actively working and breaking the laws of neutrality to help the Confederacy, all of which is centered on Bulloch, who's the kind of the spider at the center of the web, and that's what he determines that he's going to destroy by hook or by crook, and that's what he centers on. But it is a kind of a conspiracy board, just of sorts, just without all the little red thread and the manic look.
Before we had conspiracy boards.
That's right, but this was actually a real conspiracy. That's the thing.
right, exactly. No Illuminati or reptile people or anything like that. So again, without giving too much away, can you maybe give us a bit of an example of the cat and mouse games that played out on the streets of Liverpool?
Yes, it's again, this was a long fought war between Dudley and Bulloch, and they are continually trying to outwit each other. And Dudley is trying to acquire evidence, legal evidence of Bulloch's nefariousness, and Bulloch is merrily outwitting him at every corner. Or he's got spies everywhere. He's actually at one point he actually has a spy at Dudley's Lincoln, no, it's not Lincoln, his lawyer's office, who's passing him information on Dudley's case building against him. So it's almost as if Bulloch is this magician. He can see around corners, and he knows what, or some sort of psychic. It's almost as if he knows what Dudley's about to do before he even does it. And so, Dudley is really struggling against this. And one of the reasons the book's called The Lion and the Fox is that it's actually a quote, or part of a quote from, or citing Petrarch, and which I think goes, where the lion's skin will not fit, you must patch it out with the foxes. Now, in this scenario, Dudley is the lion. He's stout and he's valiant and he is rigid about his abolitionist sentiments, whereas Bulloch is the cunning fox. What happens over the course is that whereas Dudley at the beginning, and I described this in the book, Dudley is outdone at every turn here. He learns to think like a fox, and he learns to play Bulloch's game. And eventually, and I don't think it's any great secret here, any great spoiler, he beats him hands down and takes him down, using his own methods against him. So that's part of the the sort of the spy versus spy aspect of this. But there's a lot of skullduggery, and there's Bulloch has a mole in the Foreign Office feeding him information, and Dudley has his own detectives playing, going in and trying to infiltrate Bulloch's organization. It's all quite entertaining stuff.
Alex, this has been a fascinating story, and I've loved learning about these spies. Particularly, you think of spies and spycraft as more of a modern, at least 20th century thing. It's fascinating to see it in the more distant past.
Well, I find ye old time historical espionage, as I call it, more interesting than the modern stuff, just because it's nobody's really excavated a lot of this. And so I have a Substack I write every couple of weeks called Espionage, which deals with jumps around history with examining interesting cases of this kind of thing.
And so if people want to pick up a copy of this book or learn more about your work, where can they go?
You can, well, it's coming out on December 6th, but you can, I've got a website at alexrose.com, which has a list of all of my the opera omnia of my books. There's the Substack newsletter, Espionage, and you can pick it up in all good and okay-ish bookshops.
All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me tonight.
Well, what do you guys think of this one? I love this episode. I thought this was a lot of fun. Dueling spies on the streets of Liverpool is super captivating. I'd love to hear what you think about it. There's actually a feature, if you're a Spotify listener anyway, where if you scroll to the bottom, you can tell me what you think. So I'd love to know your input and your thoughts, and any words you'd like me to pass along to Alex, I'd be happy to do that as well. Thank you again to Alex for taking the time to talk to me and work through all of our technical issues. If you listen to this and you'd like to learn more, there is a link to The Lion and the Fox down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. There's also, if audiobooks are more your thing, there is a link to the audiobook version as well. And then Alex mentioned towards the end of our interview some links to some of his personal work. His website is Substack. I've got links for that as well if you want to check those out. Well, this is it for 2022. We are done for the year. So again, thank you to everyone in apparently in 43 countries across the world. Thanks for listening. This will be it until probably mid to late January. Taking a little bit of time off, plus I have jury duty. Day after Christmas, I have to go report for jury duty. I'm going to be a grand juror, apparently. I've never done that before, so I'm sure it will be an interesting experience. But anyway, after that, I do have some interviews lined up. Take me a couple weeks to edit them and so forth, but going to be talking with Buddy Levy about the history of Arctic exploration. Our good friend Dean Job's going to be returning to the podcast. He's going to talk about his book on the Acadians and their migration from eastern Canada. And then a little further out, we're going to be talking with Patty McCracken about a murder ring of several women that used arsenic poisoning. So a little bit of true crime on the docket as well. So I'm really looking forward to 2023. I think there's going to be a lot to look forward to, and of course, I hope that you'll be there with me for it. If you like this podcast, if you've been a listener, or if you're brand new, feel free to like it on whatever you listen to it on. I'd really love a review. I'm trying to build up my review base. I think a lot of people, when they're checking out podcasts, they kind of scroll through and see if it gets decent reviews, and if I have kind of not many reviews, it doesn't pop up. So I'm trying to build up that reservoir of reviews. So if you could drop a review, that would be great. And then if you want to follow the show, I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, newly Mastodon, Facebook as well. So you can follow along, introduce yourself. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it. I'm going to leave you today with an excerpt from the show's Patreon. Periodically with guests, most guests, I end up asking a bonus question for supporters of the show on Patreon, where they give me a little bit extra bonus Q&A, and usually those answers are really insightful. So I asked Alex what it's like trying to research spies, these people who intentionally do not want to be found. That's kind of in a way, a historian's nightmare. And so he offered a great response to that. And so I'm gonna leave you today with a portion of his bonus Q&A. And then if you'd like to receive all the bonus Q&As yourself, head on over to the show's Patreon page at patreon.com/CMTU history. With that, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas, Happy New Year, and I look forward to seeing you all in 2023. Bye.
Well, thank you for taking a minute to answer a question for Patreon supporters. So when you research this book, how do you go about researching the actions of people who operate in the shadows and actively don't want to be found?
Well, that's the trick. As you'll find with intelligence history, spies are not generally in the habit of keeping incriminating information around. Mostly because it tends to, if it's discovered, they tend to end up at the short end of the gallows.
Right.
Which is why it's so difficult to write serious books about the secret world, as I like to call it. In this case, well, in the case of the Washington spies, I was very lucky in that, in the fact is the Culper ring, who were the stars of that book, they had a secret correspondence with George Washington that was about 150 letters that were scattered all around the Library of Congress and that hadn't been looked at in, I don't know how long, and many of which needed to be decrypted and all that kind of stuff. With this book, it was really interesting in the sense that Dudley, as the consul and being a very good consul, he every week, even sometimes a couple of times a week, he would compile a report for the State Department, which would go through the London embassy and be sent to Washington. And it's in those pages, these very, very long letters, that these reports from Liverpool, that he would say what he's been doing. And these reports are, I think they're called the U.S. consul dispatches from Liverpool, which have been sitting in the National Archives, since I guess since the Civil War, more or less. And I had them. I was very lucky in that I found them.